Welcome to the DNA of Things, where we explore the intersection of DNA, environment, and behavior to unlock and unleash human potential. Today, I'm joined by Douglas Mulhall, an environmental health innovator and author of Discovering the Nature of Longevity, Restoring the Heart and Body by Targeting Hidden Stress. This conversation is really for anyone passionate about redefining how we approach aging, longevity, and chronic disease. Together, we explore his groundbreaking research on elastin, calcification, and the untapped potential of restoring the very fibers that keep our bodies flexible and healthy. Prepare for a paradigm-shifting discussion that challenges traditional approaches to health and reveals how we can actively shape our long-term well-being. Let's dive in. I'm pleased today to welcome Douglas Mulhall to the DNA of Things. He is a environmental health innovator and author whose work is transforming how we understand aging and cardiovascular health. His latest book, Discovering the Nature of Longevity and Restoring the Heart and Body by Targeting Hidden Stress, sheds light on groundbreaking discoveries about elastin fibers, calcification, and how they play a crucial role in longevity and overall health. The book is obviously a provocative piece of work. I had never heard of this position before. Once I spoke with Douglas, I learned a lot more about his background and insofar as founding Elastin Therapeutics, a company developing therapies to reverse this arterial calcification. And, his work is, he's a pioneer throughout many industries. He focuses very much on economics, environmental health, and, looking at disruptive innovation and a leader on the forefront of change. So really excited to dive in today to learn more about you, Douglas. Welcome to the DNA of Things.
It's great to be here, and thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be hosting my closest neighbor, as it turns out. I'm broadcasting from Halifax, Nova Scotia, kind of small, isolated Far East spot in Canada. And who knew that you are, literally 30 minutes from my doorstep over there in Chester, Nova Scotia.
Actually, Halifax isn't so far off the bitten trail, so to speak. It's becoming quite a biotech center. It's one of these, cute little hidden secrets.
That's true. That's the dormant Torontonian in me, in my upper Canadian.
That's right.
Ignorance, let's say. But you know what? I've lived in Halifax, Nova Scotia longer than I have in Toronto, so I should know better by now. But let's get back to you. You have an amazing, entrepreneurial path. You spent time in, I think, Germany. You're doing a ton of work on the therapeutic side and innovation there. Maybe if you could just walk us through, how, this discovery came about, how the book came to be. I'd love to learn more about you, the hero on this hero's journey.
Well, I think it's more about me writing about the heroes. But, you said, Jeremy, that the book is provocative. I think that's the reason I wrote it, is because the one thing that I do have is a somewhat unique combination of experiences, bringing the benefits and the insights of environment to health. It's amazing today still how many people don't connect environment with health. A lot of my environmental science colleagues say, well, we don't do health. I said, well, yes, you do. You're all about health. So, and on the other side, as you know, many biotech experts and doctors have no training whatsoever in environment. And the reason that's so important is because environment is all about epigenetics. And for those of you who haven't heard about epigenetics, it's actually the Greek word for over, so over genetics. And that's to say that epigenetics is the thing that turns your genes on and off. And that is almost entirely dictated by your environment. So that's what I bring to the table. And I think that's allowed us to move forward in some areas that just normally medical science wouldn't pay much attention to. And that's especially related to the topic that we're going to be talking about today. So in terms of, what got me here, you mentioned these two terms, and I think it's worth talking about them for a moment. One is calcification and the other is elastin. We'll get into them in more detail, but just as a helicopter view, calcification is something that occurs all around the world in everything from mollusks to humans, and in our bones and in our arteries. So it's a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type of thing, just like elastin is, and we'll be talking about that in a moment as well. So the reason it's a Jekyll and Hyde is because it's great when it's in your bone or it's in something where it's designed to be, but it's not so great when it gets into your arteries and turns them to stone, which actually happens in every single one of us. And so even very, very, very long-lived people, the main reason that the ultra long-lived people die is because they turn to stone. They just basically their organs and arteries creak to a halt because they calcify. And so this has been something that medical science has been struggling with, and it's more commonly referred to as, guess what? Hardening of the arteries. So, and hardening of the arteries directly leads to hypertension, which is one of the most common afflictions as people get into their middle and older ages. So you can appreciate the critical importance of calcification in, first of all, keeping us healthy in our bones and keeping us sick in our arteries. But beyond that, what's the connection to this elastin fiber? So again, as a helicopter view, elastin fiber is the stuff that basically drives every move we make, every step we take, every breath we take. It's in every organ of the body. And without it, we wouldn't be able to move. So it's also a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde because when it gets older, it turns against you. It actually it turns your immune system against you. And that is a lot of the cause of the chronic conditions, inflammation, heart disease that come along with it. So calcification and elastin go together. And what I didn't realize until I'd been studying calcification for about 10 years was the incredibly important role that elastin fiber plays in provoking calcification. And so that's the link between those two things.
Interesting. It's kind of like a push-pull, isn't it, on these two culprits and alleviators potentially, if you can balance it just right. Yeah. What motivated me to start this podcast, so, I call it the DNA of things, but of course it's a bit of a misnomer, right? It is, how does that DNA, the code of life come to be expressed? And it has a lot to do with where it is, right? So the environment and the effects on it. And, an interesting thing is, let's say in our evolutionary classes, whether it be in high school or university, we learn that it is, descent with modification. So, mutations are passed on, and that's how evolution happens. We're not taught that, or what we're taught is acquired characteristics are not passed on. There isn't an intergenerational transmission, and at least not something that we can detect in the actual bases in the DNA. But this new thing, this interesting thing of epigenetics is like, oh, well, actually, if your parents or even your grandparents experienced some kind of environmental stress, there's those epigenetic changes. So the methylation or acetylation, and it makes some regions of the DNA more accessible than others. So maybe, your propensity to build up calcium or have more elastin, in the case of the Dutch hunger famine, I often, cite that study where, it's individuals who were in the womb during that time are manifesting generations later paranoid schizophrenia and increased rates of obesity, which kind of makes sense. If you're born during a time of starvation, it makes sense to store your nutrients, and it makes sense to be paranoid. So just this whole kind of paradigm shifting view of our health, like, well, what were we inherited with besides our DNA? It's like, well, the propensity or the predisposition for its expression. Now, the good news is there's DNA, there's environment, but then there's also the behavior, right? And so this is how we, literally build our character by, and actually biologically by making conscientious changes. So if we can pair our knowledge about the DNA, the environment that we, come from or are in now, we get to affect these these changes. And I'm saying all this, I think, to really kind of set up the next question, because I think one of the things we talked about last time was this notion that, like, well, heart disease gallops in your family. And, is that necessarily a genetic predisposition? Is that an environmental predisposition? Is that a behavioral predisposition? And you're starting to kind of really pull those pieces apart. And well, I think I'll let you say it, but it certainly, is an argument more for self-determinism. So that is to say, you are not fated.
That's correct.
With this particular outcome. So tell me about your personal experience there.
Well, no, but you hit the nail on the head. It's not, you may be predisposed to it, but the fact of the matter is that heart disease is an epigenetic disease. It's not it's usually not a genetic disease. A very, very small percentage of heart defects, for example, are, genetically triggered. But the stuff that we have an epidemic of today, hardening of the arteries, is entirely an epigenetic factor. Has everything to do with all the things that people have heard of. But there are two things that you said I just want to come back to. One is this thing about the difference between calcium and calcification. So calcium is essential for the functioning of all cells. And, calcium exchange is really critical to the whole thing. But calcification is actually calcium phosphate. It's the combination of the two. And so, calcium is a component of that. So just so people know that. The other thing is that you were talking about the DNA of things. Well, there's actually an elastin gene, the ELN gene. So genetics is very much involved with it. And one of the things that's really interesting is that obviously over the eons, the elastin gene has been remarkably successful at sticking around because of the essential role that it plays in helping us move. I mean, millions of years ago, probably nothing could have moved around very well if the body hadn't invented elastin. And not only that, but elastin is an extremely complicated substance. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and I'm just going to come back and answer your question. Yes, heart disease gallops in my family. When my dad was my age, he'd had 3 heart attacks and then was dead. That was a fairly good motivator. And the thing is that I was, when he died, they could actually not tell me exactly what he died of. They said it was heart disease, but they actually, it could have been an aneurysm. It could have been burst this, burst that. But I was never really satisfied with the explanations that I got about how heart disease gets started. And especially this idea of cholesterol, which, there's a big controversy over cholesterol. Everybody says if you have high cholesterol, then you got a higher chance of developing heart disease. Fine, you can argue with that or not. 50% of the people who have heart attacks don't have high cholesterol. So, there's something else going on there. And that's what I was interested in, is what is causing that cholesterol to collect all that gunk in your arteries. And that's what got me started. That was so I said it's a combination of scientific curiosity and self-preservation. And so I started looking at this, and I realized that actually calcification comes along, and its precursors come along a lot sooner than the gathering of the fats in your arteries. This is happening in the wall of your arteries. And this is something that most people are just simply unaware of. That you can go into how many types of calcification there are. There's sort of 2 principal types, but in both cases, the hardening of the arteries really provokes this inflammatory response, this chronic inflammatory response, that then leads to damage to the elastin in your arteries, that then leads to your body's immune system turning against itself because it sees this as a threat, that then leads to all of your immune cells congregating at the site of the damage. And guess what those immune cells do? They emit these things called exosomes, thousands and thousands of exosomes from each cell. And the wall of those exosomes is comprised of fat. So they're sending off proteins in these nice little packages to try and fix the problem. But when they get there, when they pile up, you get fat piling up. In other words, So that comes along a lot later than the earlier damage. So that sequence of events that I just described to you in 2 minutes took about 20 years to figure out.
Wow. Wow. And so let me just backtrack there. I'm sure people listening have heard a lot about collagen, as a, let's say a fiber that, is elastic,
Yep.
let's say, and the elasticity of collagen diminishes or decreases over time. What's the connection between elastin and collagen, if any?
Well, that's a really interesting term you use, because actually collagen is not elastic. Collagen lends firmness and strength to your tissue and to your skin and to every organ in your body. It's the opposite of elasticity. So woven in between the collagen are these strands of elastin fiber. They only usually make up somewhere between 1% and 5% of the tissue, but they are absolutely critical to the functioning of your body. And the reason for that is because this incredible fiber can expand and contract up to 8 times its standing length and snap back in a fraction of a second, billions of times in your life without being replaced. Now think about that for a moment. And for anyone who wants to get a really practical idea of what elastin fiber is all about, I always do something called the pinch test. And Jeremy, you can do it right now with me. For people who are listening, I'll explain it. But basically, you take the back of your hand and you pinch it up between your thumb and your forefinger. You hold it up for 2 or 3 seconds and you let it go. Now, in a younger guy like you, snaps back, right? In an older guy like me, it goes down more slowly. When you're really old, it doesn't go down at all. And that's the elasticity. That's not the collagen in your skin. So that's a sort of a graphic display of why elastin is so important. And by the way, that display also applies to every organ in your body, because the same thing that's happening to your skin is happening to your organs. So that, in a nutshell, is the importance of elastin fiber in terms of what it does. But the Mr. Hyde, the nasty part of it is that your body stops producing it around the age of 30. And it doesn't stop producing the building blocks, but for some reason that no one has been able to figure out why, it doesn't assemble the building blocks into elastin fiber anymore, which causes a whole bunch of trouble, because first of all, you've got these elastin fragments kicking around all around the body and in the blood that aren't doing anything except causing inflammation. And the second thing is the elastin is no longer being regenerated or replaced when it's damaged. So you get a chronic inflammatory response. It's a low-level response, which is why in the book I call it hidden stress, because you don't really notice it.
Right.
So that's the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde of elastin.
Okay, so now you're, I think, motivated on the therapeutic side of this too. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's what drove me towards this whole thing. And like I said, when I first started working on calcification, we were working with an inventor who had developed a nutraceutical that has actually it's been on the market for 20 years. It's called Nanobac TX, and it has been actually quite successful in anecdotal clinical studies in improving pulse wave velocity and improving cardiac and arterial function. But, it wasn't just because it was affecting calcification. I figured there must be something else there at work. Well, we continued investigating this, and lo and behold, 10 years later in 2015, I was just keeping a watching brief on this while I was doing my other environmental product work. And I came across this publication by Professor Naren Vivahari at Clemson University, who described evidence of being able to not only reverse calcification, but also restore elastin fiber and regenerate it. And that was my eureka moment. As I read through the paper, I went, this is the missing link. And as I began to investigate more and more, I began to realize that elastin fiber is what's behind all of this. And one other thing I want to add, the reason that it hasn't garnered much attention until very recently is because scientists tend to focus on cells. Well, elastin fiber is in the space between your cells, which happens to be the biggest space in your body. It's called the extracellular matrix. And very little attention has been paid to the extracellular matrix, as you know, until quite recently. It was just generally thought as a space where a couple of things went on, but nothing so important. Well, actually, no, it's almost the opposite. The ECM is where all these proteins are wandering around, all these exosomes are wandering around and exchanging information between cells.
Mm-hmm.
So the extracellular space has suddenly become so extremely important, and elastin fiber is exactly where that's located.
You know, I hear you describe this, scenario or this phenomena at the molecular level, this, as you say, the intracellular matrix. And it actually makes me think of, some folks in my high performance network on this like recent discovery of fascia and fascia manipulation, right? So,
and there's just been a book published on fascia.
Mm-hmm.
That's correct. And New Scientist did a big article on fascia, which is the fancy word for that fiber that's in the extracellular matrix. Yes.
Right. And it's the tissue, let's say, that, surrounds all of the muscle. And, and you start to get, injuries, let's say like, hamstring pulls, et cetera. And it, scar tissue forms there as, we need it to, but it actually creates.
And the reason it forms
Mm-hmm.
is because the elastin can't be repaired. So when elastin is severely damaged, especially in people over 30, it doesn't regenerate. And so the body basically tries to wall it off and creates scar tissue.
Right.
And so again, here you have, scar tissue. And by the way, we're going to talk about how that's been solved, amazingly enough, in a few minutes. But this scar tissue is a direct result of permanent damage to elastin fiber.
Well, let's talk about that. How has that been solved? Is there a way to, once you've got an injury, is there an intervention that's required at a certain point? Or once the scar tissue is formed, can you go back and correct it retroactively? Or what's the research saying?
Yeah, all of the above. But basically, there are two major areas of elastin-directed therapy. And when I say elastin therapy, I'm not saying treating people with elastin. I'm talking about treating the elastin. So that's because people hear about elastin therapy and, I'm taking elastin. Well, it's just nonsense.
Gotcha. Okay.
So it's very important. So you're repairing the elastin.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of vocabulary in here that I want to explain as we go along so people just get the accurate view of it. So the discovery that was made in Australia at the University of Sydney by a team led by Professor Tony Weiss was that when you create a scaffold and put the precursor to elastin, which is tropoelastin, onto that scaffold, it can actually kickstart the elastin repair process in wounds. And that was discovered around 2005. And this year, it has gone into a clinical trial. And just to give you an idea of how significant that finding is, there was a company called Elastigen that was spun off out of the University of Sydney for this technology. And it was bought up by, I think it was Amgen, that was then bought up by AbbVie. And so AbbVie owns it now. But the key thing is it was the biggest startup buyout in Australia's history, 250 million. And that will give you an idea how one big pharma company woke up and smelled the coffee. It was truly amazing. And the interesting thing about it is that they woke up and smelled the coffee for two reasons. The first one is there was no such thing as this type of wound repair in the market. But the second one is the division that was working on it had no real conflicting interest in things like heart disease therapy. So there was a much more of an incentive to go into this area. Just plainly put, a lot of companies have a vested interest in the heart disease therapies that, kind of keep you going, but don't really, make you any better. And So they're not terribly excited about, oh, well, actually, we might not need those anymore because we're restoring this elastin fiber. But that is something that's down the road, although that is the second part of the pathway to discovery. And that second part happened at Clemson University, as I mentioned before, when Professor Narendra Vihari discovered a substance known as a polyphenol that a lot of people have heard of. It's in grapes, it's in vegetables, et cetera, et cetera. And one particular polyphenol has this wonderful property of kickstarting the elastin regeneration process. And that was discovered through an exhaustive series of experiments that began by looking at tannins, which are, a form of polyphenol. Mm-hmm. And that's what they discovered. They discovered in the Petri dish that, elastin was being regenerated. Now, when that was applied, very directed towards a particular part of the artery, it had that effect. And so one of the things that they started working on was aneurysms. And they delivered this polyphenol, which is known as pentagalloyl glucose, or PGG for short. They delivered it directly to the aneurysm, and lo and behold, they stabilized the aneurysm. Now, for people who are not familiar with aneurysms, Einstein died of an aneurysm. There hasn't been much progress in treating them since then. The surgery is highly risky, although it's improving. And 10 million people across the United States and Canada live with the daily threat of this stuff bursting and killing them. Mm-hmm. And so the ability to stabilize aneurysms by restoring the elastin fiber is absolutely remarkable, and it's gotten remarkably little press. Mm-hmm. So that discovery is also now in clinical trial this year after preliminary clinical studies showed that it worked. So the really good news here is that we've got two technologies that were developed independently of each other that are really entering clinical trial and could transform the way that we practice medicine in relationship to a lot of these chronic diseases.
Just going back to something you said about, medications that don't cure us, but just kind of keep us trucking along. So I'm thinking like statins, for example, right?
Yeah.
And we know we can look at things like polygenic risk scores and, predict the individual's response. Like some people are better responders versus not so. And I think really what we're pointing at is either some underlying biochemistry with the drug metabolism or something that's underlying in terms of the pathology itself.
Right. Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that because last month, a team discovered that a amino acid that is used by the body, amongst many other things, to construct elastin fiber and collagen fiber, when it is used as a therapy, lo and behold, it increases longevity in small animals. And what a surprise. Why wouldn't it if you are increasing the availability of one of the key amino acids that participates in this very important elastic fiber? So the reason I mentioned that is because you're talking about, biomarkers. Mm-hmm. This could end up opening up a very important area of research into all the different amino acids that are used for the body to create elastin fiber. A lot of the biomarkers that are used today related to elastin relate to the byproducts when it's destroyed. But this is the flip side of that coin, Jeremy. This would be the stuff that builds it. So, and we can measure that in blood, by the way. Mm-hmm. So I think it's called threonine. You'll pardon me if I mispronounced it.
Threonine,
but the presence of this in the blood can be measured. So imagine if we can get accurate measurements of all of these different biomarkers for elastin formation, that would really be something.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious if there's like some kind of connection with, elastin regulation or reactivation associated or correlated at least with, things that we're seeing, like maybe not testosterone replacement therapy, but maybe human growth hormone? Like, is there any research there? Or, I mean, even stem cells, is there some kind of interconnectedness in those therapies?
Yes. Yes. And I think what we're going to find down the road is that a lot of these longevity therapies are having the side benefit of helping the body to restore elastin fiber. I think we're just scratching the surface of the different mechanisms that can be used to repair and restore elastin.
Interesting. So tell me a little bit about the work that you're doing, with your initiative in Germany. Is that related to this, or completely separate, or complementary in some way? What's the connection there?
Well, the institute that I've worked with for the past many, many decades, well, not many, many, many decades, but is called EPEA, and that's an acronym for the Environmental Protection Encouragement Agency.
Right. Yes.
It's a little play on words because the EPA in the US is all about enforcement. We introduced a rather novel thought into the whole environmental scene in the 1990s, when everyone was protesting against the destruction of the environment. We started saying, well, we know what we're against, but what are we for? And so as a result of that, our institute developed an entire methodology that quantifies and qualifies the positive impacts of human activity, of products. Just a classic little example that I always use is that when you talk about carpets in a building, you never think of cleaning the air. And when carpet manufacturers tell you how sustainable their carpet is, they always talk about, oh, it's recyclable.
Right.
Well, we started from a completely different viewpoint. We worked with the manufacturer and we said, well, what's the number one problem in buildings? Well, the number one problem in buildings is indoor air quality.
Ventilation, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what we did is we worked with the manufacturer, Deso, in Europe, to actually create microfibers in a carpet that attracted the particulates in the air. And this was shown in studies that it reduced the amount of particulates in the air by 8-fold. So here we had, a carpet that cleans the air. And for basketball fans, Alonzo Mourning, who was many times all-time all-star in basketball, he did an ad for it. He said, I use Deso carpets because they improve my performance. I have asthma. So the reason I'm telling that story is because improving performance, improving positive impacts is something that our institute introduced with a methodology called the cradle-to-cradle design paradigm. And that is now recognized by the US EPA as one of the leading methodologies for doing exactly that. And so it's the connection to restoring elastin fiber is exactly that. Instead of talking about how we can be less destructive to the elastin fiber in the body, how can we use naturally derived chemicals, and the polyphenols that are being used are naturally derived chemicals, to restore the elastin fiber in the body. So this idea of doing these two things at once, restoring elastin fiber in the body, but doing it with naturally derived chemicals that are actually positive for the body, that only comes from a knowledge of environment together with medicine. So that's where the connection is.
Amazing. Remind me, Douglas, are you Canadian?
I am. I've spent the last 30 years outside the country. I just came back to this area about 4 years ago.
Right.
But indeed, yes.
Yeah.
I confess.
You confess, right? So yeah, like me, you're a spectator in terms of what's been happening in the U.S. Any thoughts, let's say apolitically and objectively, around the approach of RFK's involvement in the health system in the U.S.? I mean, given his history and environmental protection, his new interest on health and food quality, I'm sure you guys have overlapped on content at least.
Yeah, I will preface this by saying there are two schools of thought on what's happening in the Trump administration with health. The first one is these are all a bunch of poisonous, incompetent people who have somehow managed to get their way into the top echelons of health with their anti-vaccine and everything else. And by the way, anyone with any good reputation shouldn't be involved with them because that will destroy their reputation. So that's one field of thought. The other field of thought is, wait a minute. So let's take the example of an environmental lawyer who understands the impact of toxins in food on the human ecology. Now, as I mentioned at the top of our episode here, that knowledge of the relationship between environment, epigenetics, and the human body is critical to understanding how people get sick and how they get better. So when I hear people say that this guy Kennedy knows absolutely nothing about health, I have to ask myself, oh, is that entirely true? Because he's been working on environmental health for, a long time. So, and then when you look at this focus on going towards whole foods, which has been the topic of the leading authors in the field, like Caldwell Esselstyn and Prevent Heart Disease for the last 20 years, that makes sense. There's no question about it. How that will manifest itself in how it's applied, I have no idea. But I don't think we should dismiss it out of hand just because of all the other stuff that has gone on.
Yeah, I'm just, you might be able to help me here. I'm just thinking about even locally here. I know there was an issue in New Brunswick. I'm not sure if it was Moncton's water supply, but there were, a small number of cases associated with, I think, some level of, if it was neurotoxicity or liver toxicity. But there was there was a documentary done on it, and there were a number of deaths associated with the environment, with the water supply. But again, the pathologies were different, so it was hard to point to like the single source of, say, the water contamination as the root cause. And that's what makes, I like how you said human ecology. That's a powerful statement, right? Because it is an interaction, obviously, within your own cells internally, but it is an interaction with your environment, however far that extends, right?
Sure.
The people you hang around with, the psychological effects there. I mean, so many of these things, carrying on, and your own,
all of the above, eh?
Right.
So when people hear that, they go, "Oh my goodness, that's just too much. I can't handle it." But then when you talk about something more pointed, and this happens in water supply as well,
right?
Heavy metals like lead,
right,
for example.
Right.
So the reason heavy metals are called heavy because they're 5 times more dense than water, for anyone who's interested. That's just the chemistry definition. But it involves everything from lead to arsenic to tin. There's a whole group of them out there. And they are really bad for elastin fiber. They attack it. They cut the microfibrils off of the protective coating of elastin fiber. They trigger an inflammatory response, and they are not good at all. And the big problem is that they lodge in your tissue, so that even if you do a blood test, you won't necessarily get an accurate reading of how many of these and to what degree they are in your body. And this is an area that is vastly underemphasized, is doing the right tests on people for these heavy metals. So I just wanted to give you an example. And the thing is, we can do something about that. If you look at environmental legislation in the United States and Canada with regards to lead, it has been actually successful in reducing the emissions of lead significantly. It's not completely gone like many people think, but the result of that has been absolutely clear, is that the lead levels in humans, generally speaking, there are definitely pockets, have gone down. And that was actually shown big time in a recent clinical trial of heart disease therapies, where it was shown that actually the the degree of lead that is in the blood is a very significant player in heart disease and in helping you get better by getting that stuff out of you.
So, okay, that's kind of where I was going to go next. Is like, okay, we've got these, we're on the tip of the spear in terms of identifying the decrease in the production and the presence of elastin over time after age 30
in all of us,
in
without
all of us.
exception.
Right.
And so, not just us,
right,
but animals and reptiles as well.
Right. So, okay, and so when we look at that, is that just like on average? And what I'll preface my question is with for example, you would say, well, testosterone declines at whatever the age is, say 25 or 20. Let's just put it all at 30. Lean muscle mass declines. Is it? Well, lean muscle mass definitely declines if you don't do anything, right?
Yeah, so do you know what the things that help let muscles expand and contract is the elastin fiber. So sure. When you're losing this muscle mass,
right,
just think of it for a moment. You're not producing the elastin fiber anymore. You've got a chronic inflammatory response going on right inside all of the tissue that holds your muscles together.
Right.
So what no one has really looked at yet, and I keep harping on this, no one has really looked at this. I think you said the tip of the spear, is that degradation of the elastin actually triggering one of the triggers for the loss of the muscle mass?
Right.
So that's another area that merits investigation.
Well, and so what I was moving towards in my question is, so that's true. Let's say on average, muscle mass decreases, but there are things you can do to, let's say, decrease the rate of decay or reduction in muscle mass. So, you can lift weights, for example,
sure.
Right? Like, are there certain things you can do from a behavioral point of view to decrease the rate of elastin reduction? So detoxing, is there like specific physical exercises? Is there, diet? Is there, going into the sauna? Like, or maybe another way to ask it is, are there any outliers in terms of people who have remarkably high amounts of elastin, or have we not yet done that research?
I don't think the research has really been done. That's number one. But number two, what you said is, again, I say all of the above, because just as an example, you don't smoke.
Sure.
You got heavy metals in the cigarette smoke. It's directly attacking your elastin fiber. Same with this, the stuff that's in heavily processed foods. So and we have to split this into two parts, Jeremy. The first part is all the stuff that people have heard about, good nutrition, exercise, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, they are going to slow the degradation of your elastin fiber, but that doesn't stop the basic process from happening. And that's why the reason I wrote this book is to say, this book is not about all the exercise and diet and everything else that you can read everywhere else. A lot of people have done that far better than I have. This is about how we can directly repair this stuff and restore it, and why it's so important. So you have to divide those two things. No matter what you do, this stuff is going to stop being produced, and it's going to start falling apart in all of us.
So we don't yet have like the elastin resynthesis protocol.
Well, we certainly have pieces of it, because the pentagalloyl glucose is definitely the Kickstarter for that assembly process. The tropoelastin scaffolding that I've talked about is another one. So there are elements of that, but at the genetic level, I think that still needs a lot of exploration, which is why I mentioned earlier these amino acids that have been found to improve longevity, the same amino acids that are used for the manufacture of elastin fiber. So that could really be an important genetic key.
So are these like so you said, I think you said L-theanine or threonine is one of them. Is this like your branch chain amino acids? Is like like, because there are a lot of these blends that athletes use, like glutamine generally, because it's a rate limiting amino acid in terms of protein synthesis. But then the branch chain amino acids, for example, like is that one of the benefits of taking branch chain amino acids, that it is associated with the elastin synthesis? So I'm just kind of refreshing my memory here. So you've got
could is the answer.
Could be. Arginine, citrulline, lysine, tryptophan, tyrosine, alanine, glycine. Well, it doesn't have threonine. So
the thing is, again, this very recent research on threonine has been completely new.
Interesting. And so is it kind of like a signal molecule that would potentially in like restart synthesis, or again, is it just kind of an association at this point?
Good question. At the moment, all that they've found is it improves longevity. Whether or not it is doing that by helping to promote the generation of elastin fiber is an open question. And from our discussion, you can see, again, the tip of the spear. It's just, we are, on one hand, it's fantastic that after 20 years ago discovering what can restore elastin, that we're now being able to restore it in clinical trials. But this should be a Manhattan Project,
right?
Really, because elastin is so critical to so many of the things that we've talked about today.
What about any work on, because you often hear about sauna being kind of a blanket statement, longevity therapeutic. Do you see that tied into translating to these health benefits with
there's no question. Again, and I'm sorry to harp on it, but just imagine for a moment the things that keep our insides flexible, that literally, I mean, it's in your lungs. Your lung sacs only expand and contract because of elastin. Your arteries only expand and contract. It's not just your heart that drives blood through your arteries. It's your arteries themselves. That's called pulse wave velocity.
Sure. Yeah.
And all of this, including in your heart. So your heart, your lungs. By the way, you can't have sex without elastin, because a lot of the sex organs expand and contract thanks to elastin fiber.
Right.
Every time you pee, you're using elastin fiber in the bladder. So imagine if you can maintain the health and flexibility of elastin fiber. Imagine the impacts on your ongoing health and your healthy longevity.
Yeah.
And this is something that is so far below the radar right now. It's absolutely amazing. And again, it's why I wrote the book, and why I'm, working with people like you to make sure that everyone gets a better understanding of the significance of this stuff.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I'm sure there'd be, so it sounds like there's great, potential here for longevity. I would suspect there's probably an application for athletes in terms of injury avoidance, potentially.
Good point.
Yeah.
Good point. Yes. Professional athletes, teams, the recovery period for a torn ligament is very long and very expensive. It costs hundreds of millions of dollars for sports teams.
Yeah.
So imagine if you can accelerate that process.
Yeah. Well, and they're doing that now with things like, adding stem cells and platelet rich plasma injections. And but I mean, imagine even in, muscle tears, a lot of these actually superficial things that go unchecked, like say a hamstring tear or a quad tear or a calf.
And they never heal properly.
And then what happens when they're left unchecked is you get, potentially, an injury at the level of the tendon or ligament, which is, much more severe and really difficult to come back to. Labral tears, for example. So a lot of things that I see with athletes in general is, you have stress that's like a strategic stress on the body that if the program had been designed well, you've got, it's not right to say that a well-balanced athlete, because, you look at the difference of like a a marathon runner and a shot putter and everything in between. And there are all kinds of these, human phenotypes that we can manifest as a result of what I'm saying is this strategic stress. And what we're actually seeing is a compensation, and we might say a healthy compensation is one where, the athlete doesn't get injured in the short term, but I've yet to meet an athlete who doesn't have any kind of long-term injury or impact because of
repetitive stress.
Yeah, if you avoid the the acute injury, then you're dealing with the aftermath of the repetitive stress, and then you've got a series of treatments later on that are more than likely going to be surgical.
And this is another example of where we need to get some translational research going. And I mean, if you know of any professional sports teams who are interested in saving themselves several $1 million, this is something that I think they should invest in.
Mm-hmm. Well, them, and then also the the orthopedic surgeons that are treating them, integrating this potentially as part of the as part of the intervention, as part of the surgical practice. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of people regard the surgeons as the enemy, but actually, a lot of orthopedic surgeons would be quite happy to accelerate this process with their patients.
Yeah. Well, then there's an opportunity for a consultation too, right? It's like, hey, this is why this happened. Here's what you can do so it doesn't happen again, right?
Correct.
Physio, I could see physiotherapists being a great point of, distribution, good distribution channel, good, they're very focused on education as well. So amazing. So what do you have on the go in the future? You've done all this research, you've got your efforts that you're continuing on in the, the environmental side of things is I'm interested to know what the confluence of these things brings in the future. What's on the horizon, so that we can follow you.
Yeah. Well, first of all, this isn't something you just jump into and jump out of.
Sure.
This is like, this may take a good part of a lifetime to really get this thing going.
Mm-hmm.
We need massive investment into restoring the elastin fiber in the body.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I'm working on, just to get the message out there. Now, having said that, one of the areas that I think is the next frontier, which is rather obvious, is AI. Because AI is going to play a crucial role in predicting the different levels of damaged elastin in different parts of the body, the biodistribution of that damaged elastin, the biodistribution of the drugs that are actually used so that you can get proper dosing. And so I think that AI is really going to accelerate that type of translational research. So that's a critical area that I would see moving forward on.
Amazing. So one of the things I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, Douglas, was, hey, if this was your last podcast, so let's distill it down. What's the message we want to get out? Who's got to hear it? And then based on our conversation, who would you recommend to have on the DNA of things?
Sure. Well, first of all, when you say what one person would you target, you got to remember something. This affects everybody.
Yeah.
Absolutely everybody. I think within that group, because it's easy to say, it affects everybody. Within that group, I think people who are in their 30s and are starting to feel like they're not as supple as they used to be, I think they've got a real good motivation to start paying attention to this. And that's because, they can definitely do something about it, and they've got a long enough runway that, they can really do something about it. And by the time you're in your 30s, I think you're interested enough, at least that's what I've seen from people in that age group these days, to start looking at some of these innovations. So, and in terms of who I would bring on the show, I think Tony Weiss and Naren Vivahari, the two pioneers, would be really interesting to bring on the show for this.
Cool. Well, thank you for that. As you used the word supple, you made me think of a good friend of mine, Dr. Kelly Starrett. He's an athletic therapist based in San Francisco, Marin County, I want to say. He owned one of the first CrossFit gyms. And as I mentioned, he's a doctor of athletic therapy. And he was seeing a lot of injuries, happen in CrossFit, as they do in almost any sport, but, CrossFit by its nature is, you're competing against others, but yourself, and really pushing the limits and doing so under, immense amount of fatigue and a heavy load and lifts. So anyway, he started to see a lot of injuries. So he, created a solution for that called, so CrossFit at the time, the workouts were called Workout of the Day, WOD. And so he created an antidote to the injuries, which is called Mobility WOD, Mobility Workout of the Day. And he's since rebranded it to the Ready State. But he actually wrote a book called The Supple Leopard. And, much of his work is about, self-manual therapy. So all kinds of like band tractioning and rolling and archetypal positions. But hey, maybe there's a conversation for you guys to have, since he's got that, kind of focus from the macro level. Maybe there's something there on the micro level that might be a synergistic conversation. So,
well, I would welcome that. And also maybe he has contact to some of these professional sports organizations that should really be investing in this.
Yeah, for sure. Well, you know what? I'm going to send him this episode. That's for sure. And let's see where it goes. Douglas, thank you so much for your time today. Fascinating discussion. Really excited to follow your innovation.
Well, it's been great being on the show. And I hope that, by the way, if people want to get the book, they can go to Amazon.com, and it's Discovering the Nature of Longevity, Restoring the Heart and Body by Targeting Hidden Stress.
Thank you. That reminds me, where else can people find you? So you mentioned where they can find the book. Where can they find you if they want to connect with you?
They can connect with me through my website, which is natureoflongevity.com, but there's a short title for it as well. It's calcify.com.
Nice.
calcify.com.
Great.
And there's a contact form there. They can get a hold of me there.
Perfect. I will throw all of that into the show notes. And looking forward to the synergies that come out of this meeting. Thank you so much, Douglas.
Thank you so much for having me. That's a valuable service you're performing by letting people know about this.
All right. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the DNA of Things. Douglas Mulhall shared a compelling vision for the future of health and longevity, grounded in cutting-edge research on elastin and calcification. We delved into how these hidden processes impact every aspect of our well-being and the transformative therapies on the horizon. This conversation is a must listen for those eager to take control of their health and rethink the very nature of aging. If this appealed to you, please share it with someone who you think could benefit, and let's expand this vital conversation. Until next time, stay curious and let's keep shaping the DNA of your life.